be
She
doing
does some
news.
commercial work, yeah.
Oh, she should be their
I
news
think we're
person.
ready.
Are we ready? Okay.
Jim?
All right.
This is the Nebraska Broadcasters Association History Project. It's a look at the people and the personalities who have made Nebraska radio and television what it is today. We thank WOWT Channel 6. Thanks to Jeff Saban for his help. For the NBA, I'm Neil Nelkin. Nebraska broadcasting in some ways is actually a little bit like Nebraska football. It's very accommodating to Nebraska-born, Nebraska-bred talent. I guess you can almost call them walk-ons. When you start out early in Nebraska broadcasting, you build a career here. You become one of those people associated with the best and the brightest in broadcasting in this state. Then it's time to do a biographical video. Today's guest is one such broadcaster. During his time in the business, he's built a reputation for success. His links to the University of Nebraska, legendary. Soon to be overshadowed, however, by the performance of his kids. I think he'll be the first one to recognize that. Best known for his connections to Nebraska athletics and his day job at KFAB Radio. We welcome Jim Rose to the Nebraska Broadcasters Association History Project. Hello, Jim.
Neil, it's great being here, and you're right. I pine for the day when my kids can exceed me, and believe me, that's a very low bar.
Yeah, well, you've done a pretty good job. You and Jen have done a great job with those kids.
Thank you very much.
Let's take you back, kind of like this is your life. As a kid in Lincoln, you were going to Lincoln Southeast High School, and you had this feeling that you wanted to be somehow involved in athletics.
Yeah, at the time, the head football coach was Frank Solich. You might have heard of him. And
At Lincoln Southeast.
At Southeast High School. He was very successful. He'd won a couple of state championships and had a lot of great players. And you know, he was a littler guy, and I was a littler guy. I'm still a littler guy. And I thought, if he can play football, I can play football. So my first big goal was I wanted to play football for Frank Solich at Southeast High School. It took about 14 picoseconds looking at me for him to say, Jim, I don't care how big your heart is, you can't play football. You just don't have what it, unless you run about a 4.040, I'm afraid football's not for you. There are a lot of sports that are, this doesn't have to be one of them. So I was a little heartbroken, but the fact that he cared enough said, you know what, I want to get close to this guy. And for Coach Solich and I, it's a relationship I cherish greatly. It continues to this day. I wish I saw him more often, but it was wonderful to talk to him at the Outland Trophy event in Omaha last year, and I'm so thrilled for his success.
He was your driver's ed teacher.
He was, and he taught driver's education a lot like he coaches, which can be a little intimidating to some people. But I rose to the challenge. I remember one day he took a liking to me because I volunteered to learn how to parallel park. Now, parallel parking for most people is tantamount to appearing nude in front of 5,000 people. But I said, you know what? Frank Solich is looking for somebody to step up to the challenge. I did, and I won him over just learning to parallel park. And I didn't wreck the car.
You get out of Lincoln Southeast, and you know football's not your career. But where did you go? Why did you go in the direction you went into? And who were the people you kind of looked up to at that time?
Well, I was kind of fortunate or unfortunate. I kind of had an idea that I liked this business early on, even before I got to high school. I was either blessed or cursed with the notion that radio is for me. I've always loved it. I just think it's a cool medium. I love how personal it is. And I loved listening to the radio when I was a kid. So even at a very young age, I kind of thought this is what I wanted to do. And in high school, and Coach Solich helped me with this, and also the basketball coach, Wally McNaught at Southeast, KFOR Radio in Lincoln, which was the first station at which I worked, had a program where they had one kid from every high school follow their team each football season and do a 30 to 45-second report on the game if it wasn't on KFOR that night.
So you were like a stringer for the
Exactly. They were carrying the Lincoln High East game. They needed somebody to report on the Southeast Northeast game. So that was me. And I filed one diligently every single game, and I even did the basketball games on the road, and they paid me $50 a year, including travel expenses for that.
So you were a professional broadcaster.
I was in the business. It was show business. I'd have paid them to do it. But I was there every night, and they took notice of that. The operations manager and the nighttime disc jockey took notice of that, and so they said, this the Rose kid might work out. And they thought it was okay. So I kept doing that during high school, and then when I got to college, there were more opportunities for me. And I was given so many wonderful opportunities at such a young age to be around terrific people. That helped feed my passion for the business.
Now, at the university, did you ever work at KRNU?
I did. I did work at KRNU, and there's a funny story to that. I actually was a little bit advanced because I'd had a chance to be on the radio. So they saw me as somebody that kind of knew his way around the operation. So I was actually taking on-air broadcasting classes as a sophomore. And I remember I was assigned a news shift at 10 o'clock in the morning. You know, there were so many kids, you'd have a 10 o'clock shift, an 11 o'clock shift, and a noon shift. So my first day doing the news on KRNU, I walked into the booth and I delivered this newscast, and I thought it was all right. I walk out, and one of the professors, Bob McMullen, who I'd never met, wheeled around the corner and said, "Who just did that newscast on the radio station? Who did that?" And everybody's looking around, you know, pointing to this guy. And I go, "That'd be me." He goes, "Come to my office. I want to see you." And I'm thinking, did I drop an F-bomb on the air? Did I goof something? Did I botch my subject predicate agreement? I mean, what's going on here? So he closes the door and he said, "What's your name?" I said, "I'm Jim Rose." He said, "Okay, that sounded pretty good. You need to be doing some things to enhance this experience for you. What do you want to do?" So I did a 20-minute interview with Bob McMullen, and he was a great mentor for me too. But I enjoyed KRNU. That was a great place for me to get a lot of experience and meet a lot of people.
So you're working at KFOR, and you graduated from football stringer to night disc jockey.
Yeah. Well, the first job actually was overnights on weekends. Now, again, I'd have paid those guys to work there, but the first gig was midnight to 6 a.m. on holidays. The night before Thanksgiving, the night before Christmas, New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, so that the regular guys could get the night off. Because all of these radio stations at the time had full-time people working 24 hours a day. We didn't have the computer automation and computer systems today that can run the stations. So they wanted to give the regular guys a couple days off, so in comes the part-time help. And in I am working the Larry King Show and just messing around at the radio station. It was really great because the Larry King Show sort of ran itself. I had to do a weather every half an hour. Otherwise, I could mess around in the radio station, listen to tapes of Husker games, of Tim Moreland and Dick Perry, who had been doing the games on KFOR in those days, play-by-play. So I was in heaven. Unfortunately, the operations manager at the time was paid on an expense budget bonus system, and he informed me that they don't pay part-timers. Now, that didn't matter to me because I was in show business. I wanted to stay on the air, but my mom and dad thought it was not a good use of my time. So I had to say goodbye to that shift.
Mom brought you to your senses.
Mom said, "You're not doing that for nothing. You can sack groceries at Super Saver and at least get paid." So I was kind of out of the business and heartbroken until later in the year when a new operations manager was hired, and he offered me a regular part-time shift, and it was prime time, 6 p.m. to midnight.
On KFOR.
On KFOR. And of course my ratings were huge because the Kansas City Royals were on at that time.
So you used to plug in commercials during the game.
That's right.
It was good training, though.
Yeah, it was great training.
From KFOR part-time, how did you make it to an actual full-time job?
Well, it was great again because there were so many opportunities for me. I can't thank the people at the university and the people at KFOR enough for all of the chances that they gave me. As I was going through college, they kept giving me new things to do. I'd host the Talk to Tom show whenever the regular host, Chuck Stevens, had to be away or was on a vacation. I would do morning drive sports. I would do play-by-play of high school football games. I was around the University of Nebraska broadcast.
Ask Jim, he'll do it.
Exactly, and they were right, I would. And of course, at Big Red, that was a time when we had Turner Gill, Mike Rozier, and Irving Fryer on the field. The team was the #1 consensus team in the country, so there was a tremendous amount of attention. And we did a little program called the Husker Hotline, where I would do a one-on-one interview with Coach Osborne once a week. Then we would edit that material up, put it on this telco system where anybody in the whole country could call and get sound from Nebraska football, interviews that we had recorded with the players and coaches. And there were thousands and thousands of radio stations that would use our Husker Hotline to get information on Nebraska football. So the opportunity was terrific. Of course, ABC Sports and ESPN in its early years, they would come in and cover the team. And Coach Osborne was a huge, huge celebrity, extraordinarily popular. So it was a good time to be around Nebraska football. And I got to know a lot of those guys. I still know them today, and they're friends today. Mike Rozier and Turner. I don't see Irving as much, but I'll see Rozier and a lot of those guys from those teams, and that's really rewarding.
Including Johnny Rogers.
Including Johnny Rogers. So that kind of gave me a ton of experience. And then
Did you grow up listening to Lyle?
I did grow up listening. I grew up listening to all of them because, as you remember, Neil, Nebraska at one time had 4 broadcasts of the game. And it was terrific for the fans because they had a variety to choose from, and very few of the games were actually on television.
Right.
So at one time, over 90% of Nebraskans would listen to the football games on the radio. Because again, there was no TV and there was a lot of variety.
The rumor then, of course, you drive down any street in Nebraska, the windows were open, and you'd hear Nebraska football and one of the 4 networks.
Exactly. And Lyle was popular, obviously, in Omaha, but I grew up listening to the Lincoln guys. Don Gill and Dick Perry and Tim Moreland and Ray Scott. Those guys were the Lincoln radio broadcasters. So I didn't have access to Lyle and the guys up in Omaha, but I could see these guys in Lincoln all the time, and I became good friends with Tim Moreland and Ray Scott before he passed away. And Tim was a mentor and is today. They allowed me close to them. It was really nice of them to let this kid, you know, this high school teenage kid who really didn't have much on the ball, to just hang around and just be in the way. And they let me pull cable and spot in games and keep stats and just be there. And that sort of experience was invaluable.
But it wasn't work to you.
No.
As I said earlier, ask Jim. He'll do it.
It was not good for my academic record. I was never going to be a Phi Beta Kappa. I did get my degree, but I focused on that, not academic pursuits at Nebraska, which is probably a mistake.
I don't think it's a mistake, judging by what you've done, where you've been, and how you turned out. What is next in your career path?
Well, after we went to the Husker process and got through school, I was just like every other graduate. You know, here I'm walking down the aisle without a degree and no job. But fortunately, KFOR and the Stewart company that owned, the Stewart Broadcasting Company owned by a Lincoln family, had a lot of smaller market stations around the country. They didn't have Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and Dallas. They had Lincoln, Grand Island, Salina, Old Wine, Iowa, Springfield, Missouri, Sioux City, Iowa.
And it was all run by Dick Chapin.
All run by one guy, Dick Chapin, the president of the company, who's truly one of America's legendary broadcasters. His awards speak to that. And Dick is a mentor and a friend to this day. So for me, it was perfect because there was no way I was going to go from the University of Nebraska to a top 10 market without having to sit behind the scenes and never get on the air. But because they had small market stations that were perfect training grounds for the Jim Roses of the world, I was able to get a gig at one of them. And it was a terrific opportunity for me. A station in Salina, Kansas, KSAL. There aren't any television stations in Salina. It's about 45,000, but the marketplace is about 75 or 80,000, the counties. Big signal, so it went everywhere. It was an important station. They had farm news and weather and news that covered the region. So it was important to be on that station to those people. And the manager down there was a guy named Jerry Henriquez from Nebraska. Loved sports, loved radio, and he was a fabulous coach for me. He was really my first head coach. And he gave me a ton of opportunity. I mean, I was doing a game every night. I was doing a college basketball game, a small college basketball game, or a small high school football, small class football game. We did golf on the radio. We did wrestling on the radio. We did rodeo on the radio. We did Legion baseball on the radio. And he said, I want this to be known as a place where great sportscasting is done. So he let me screw up all this stuff, make all these mistakes, develop a style, but just get at-bats. And there is no substitute at that age for at-bats.
Is that where you first learned about the value of sales in relationship to sports with Jerry Henriquez?
Jerry was a really terrific marketing guy because he understood that that sports is a unique vehicle on a radio station. A lot of stations can deliver news, and a lot of stations can deliver weather, and a lot of stations do it very well. And of course, you have music on FM stations. But that sports was a unique franchise. And whether it was high school sports, small college sports, or the Kansas City Royals were on our station, and that's when they were going to the World Series. It was really important to convey to the marketing audience that this is a really good place to brand your product, because when somebody listens to a team on the air, they love the team. They're not a listener, they're a fan. And a fan stays with you all the time. They're not always pleasant, but they're always with you. So I did learn the value of marketing sports from Jerry. Now it sort of went into hibernation for me because I was all gaga about being an on-air guy. But when I got into marketing with IMG later in my career, it was really terrifically beneficial.
Then you got out of radio and you went to that terrible medium television.
Yeah. Well, I'd been in Salina for 4 years, and I loved it down there, and I was having a great time. I was making, I think, $15,000 a year, but it was
That was
great.
good money back then.
Yeah, my apartment was $235 a month.
You're single?
I was single. You could play golf for $7 a round. I mean, it was great. But the time had come for me to move along, and at the time, I had gotten to know, because I'd been doing some freelance play-by-play work for Learfield Sports and their Iowa and Oklahoma State networks, I'd gotten to know some of the guys in that lane. And one of them was a guy named Mark Allen, who was the popular sports director at Channel 10 in Wichita, KAKE-TV, which is a legendary television station run by Martin Umansky, who's kind of the Dick Chapin of television in the Midwest. Very respected. It was a tremendous opportunity. Mark was transitioning from sports to become one of the news anchors. They had interviewed 5 or 6 or 7 guys that were real television guys, and had offered it to one who accepted it, but they hadn't bothered to ask how much money he wanted. And when he laid his number down on the table, the news director clutched her chest, feigning a heart attack, and said, "Let's move on to the radio guy in Salina.
Let's
He's more in
ask
our
Jim,
budget."
he'll do it.
Yeah, they had heard that I'd do it. So Mark called me one day out of the blue and said, "Would you be interested in this job?" And I go, "I don't know how I can't be interested in this job." And so I visited with the guys in Salina that mattered to me, and some of the people in Nebraska who mattered to me, and they said, "Jim, this is something you've got to do." So I did, and it was a great experience. I don't think I was very good at it, because I need a little bit more space, you know, than 3 minutes at 5, 3 minutes at 6, and 3.5 minutes at 10. And the other thing that I was beginning to notice, Neil, and I think has borne to be true, that local television sports needed to shift to a focus completely to local content. ESPN was annexing bigger and bigger chunks of the sports audience for scores and highlights. So my highlights on Cake TV of the Royals game were dwarfed by the highlights that ESPN could provide for them. We didn't really have the staff, we didn't really have the commitment to be able to go out and do terrific local sports stories. So I began to think, you know, I could gut this out, and I could probably try to get some freelance play-by-play jobs, because we were doing the Shocker broadcast, basketball broadcast. But I really was beginning to get fascinated with an emerging format in radio, and that was talk radio.
And then the phone rang.
And the phone rang. I'm sitting in my apartment in Wichita, and the phone rang, and it's Norton Warner, who, much like Dick Chapin, is a legendary Nebraska broadcaster, highly respected, terrific guy, ironically enough from Wichita originally, and was aware of my situation because he'd worked at Cake Radio years before. And he called out of the blue and said, "Jim Rose, I'm Norton Warner." I said, "Oh, Mr. Warner, you're the KLIN guy," because I knew of him when I was in Lincoln at KFOR and respected him greatly. And he said, "You know, I've got some ideas about what I want to do with my radio station. Would you be willing to make a trip to Lincoln and talk to me about it?" And I thought, why not? So I came up, met with Norton and his wife Diana and his daughter Lisa. They owned the radio station. It was a family-owned radio station. And they wanted to convert their station into a talk station. And sports was going to be a big part of that, because Lincoln did not have a sports talk show at the time on any of the radio stations. Even though Husker sports was super big and local sports are super big, they didn't have one, but Norton thought there was a niche that could be filled, and I'd been recommended to him by several people. So he said, "I know you're in television. I know it's hard to get a TV guy back into radio." I said, "Might not be as hard as you think, because I'm not a good television guy. There are some guys that are good television guys. I don't think I'm a good one." So we got together, and sure enough, he had flipped his radio station's format to news and talk. He had a very good news department to begin with, and so that was a natural. And then this other guy took over the middays on KLIN, and you might have heard of him, Rush Limbaugh. And Rush turned the market upside down and reintroduced KLIN to a whole bunch of people who had not really ever listened to KLIN, and that was a terrific opportunity for me to build my brand.
It gave you the showcase.
It did.
And the listeners to talk about sport. You and Adrian Fiala were the play-by-play team for high school sports on KLIN for a long time.
Adrian was one of the truly great people in my life. I can say that with genuine, heartfelt sympathy and authenticity. He was a terrific player at Nebraska in 2 sports. He was a high school legend in Omaha in the 1960s. He was an educated man. He got a Juris Doctor degree and then got a master's degree in business. But he was also a terrific performer. And he was picked after school to join the broadcasts on one of those 4 radio networks that carried Nebraska. And then when they went to the one origination, a whole bunch of people were out of work, and Ade was one of them. But he kept his hand in it. You know, he didn't just say, okay, that's it, I'm a Nebraska football broadcaster and that's it. He started to do high school games and college baseball games, and he would broaden his horizon a little bit. And one of the things that he insisted on doing was to be around stations that were committed to it. And so I asked Adrian, I made a visit to his office, and I had known him from his days at KFOR on those broadcasts. I said, Adrian, I really need you to join me for these baseball broadcasts, Husker baseball broadcasts, which KLIN was also doing, and the football high school games, because it'll make us sound really good to have Adrian Fiala on the air. And he did it, and he did it for many years. He was able to get back on the broadcasts, you know, a number of years later, the Husker football broadcast. But having Adrian at my side was not only a personal, tremendous benefit to me, but he was a great broadcaster for us.
Well, looking at it from somebody who was there at the time, having you and Fiala doing the high school broadcasts on KLIN was a pretty big deal.
Well, we tried to make the kids, and you know, Neil, I say this whenever I'm asked, and I'm not asked much anymore, but I always speak to local broadcasters in Nebraska, and when I was in Kansas too, about their jobs and their career. And we have a lot of really great small market broadcasters in Nebraska. And I'll listen to them when I go duck hunting in western Nebraska. I'll drive out on a Friday and I'll hear 5, 6, 7 of them on the radio just driving down the interstate. And the ones that stand out to me are the ones that approach the job, I think, as Adrian and I did, and that is, this is the Super Bowl for them. This game is the Super Bowl or the NCAA championship finals or the College World Series final for them, for those kids, because 90% of them are not going to play sports after high school. So the broadcasters that make those broadcasts seem very, very important to the listeners are the ones that have my greatest respect. It takes work. You wonder if anybody's listening. You wonder if anybody cares. Well, I can tell you that, yeah, the kids care and the parents care. And if you do that for enough years, you become the most beloved person in that town because you made their son or daughter, a basketball player or a baseball player or a football player, sound like a really big deal, sound like an all-star. And if you do that, and Adrian and I felt strongly about that, we spent a lot of time getting to know the kids and telling stories about them. And you know, I worked as hard on the high school broadcasts as I ever did on the Husker football broadcast because I just knew how important it was to the kids and to their families. And this is their chance to be a superstar.
And it worked. It worked well. KLIN was probably your first opportunity to get exposed to the management side of radio. You became one of the go-to guys in the building when decisions had to be made, staff reassignments had to be made, what programming choices had to be made. You were always involved in those discussions.
Yeah, the Warners were really terrific local broadcasters. They cared deeply about Lincoln, and they knew what their audience was. And so we had to learn, you know, what our lane was. You know, you can't be everything to everyone on a radio station. So we carved out our niche, and they let me make mistakes. Thankfully, I never made any fatal ones. We kept the license intact, which was good. But it did give me a chance to develop young broadcasters, and one of them was John Baylor. You know, we gave John a talk show. He was just such a bright guy, and he always had a lot to say. That doesn't mean he didn't say things that got us in trouble with the powers that be. That's the nature of local broadcasting, which is not unhealthy. But it gave us a chance to develop some young talent like Gary Sharp and John Bishop and John and others who would come up through the business. That passion would be lit, that fire would be lit, and I'm so pleased and proud for all of them because they've all done so very well for themselves. They've been successful, they've reached heights, they continue to push themselves. I listen to them on the air and I can tell.
It's one of the things we do in this business, maybe not as much as we used to, as bring up the farm teams and back up the people who are going to replace us as we age, season, something like that. So KLIN is breaking you into a lot of different areas. You were broadcasting, not you particularly, but KLIN was broadcasting Husker baseball and a number of other Husker sports. You had good relations with a number of Husker coaches. Women's basketball was integral at KLIN. And then you had the opportunity to broaden that into the big game.
Yeah, it was a great time for us. The 90s were a great stretch for Nebraska in a lot of ways. Certainly the radio broadcasting industry in Nebraska became very successful. We had found a spot where a lot of talented people were getting into the business and they were staying in the business. A lot of talented salespeople were in the business. We had good ownership groups like Norton's and John Mitchell's and a number of them. And that was really excellent. Of course, the Nebraska Rural Radio Group is terrific. Mike Flood was just coming through the ground, and we all know.
Let me stop you there.
We all know what would happen with that guy.
Tell me the Mike Flood story.
Well, we're talking about young people, and I would never, Neil, and I hope people believe me when I say this, I would never take credit or even imply that I had anything to do with the success of some of these folks. But I do take pride in the fact that many of them got their start with us. And many of them were given opportunities by us at KLIN, by me, by you, by the Warners. Kevin Kugler, I mentioned John Baylor and John Bishop, Gary Sharp. Todd Baer was one of our broadcast interns on the network. He is now one of the chief Asia correspondents for Bloomberg.
Lane Grindle?
Lane Grindle later, he came down from South Dakota and was a terrific talent and bloomed into an excellent broadcaster. And then one day we needed a part-timer to help us with KLIN and one of the FMs in our building. And so we've got a stack of resumes. Some of these guys are, really not radio guys, and some of them are just looking for anything. And then along comes this resume of a graduate from Notre Dame, an honors graduate from Notre Dame, who is enrolled in University of Nebraska Law, and he wants to work part-time at our radio station. And it wasn't really an on-air job. It was just sort of a button pusher guy like I did back in the 80s.
Running ball games.
Running ball games, making sure the computers are not smoking. It's not a great gig, but it does get you into the business. And his name was Mike Flood. And so we brought Mike Flood, the programming director for one of the FMs, and I interviewed Mike Flood one afternoon, and I said, "What are you doing here? Look at you. You're a grad of Notre Dame and you're in law school. You're not us, And he goes, "Well, I want to get into the radio business." I said, "Is that all?" He goes, "Well, actually, first I want to be governor of Nebraska."
And almost became governor.
And might yet still one day become governor of Nebraska. But I love the radio business. He was from Norfolk. I love the radio business. My dad and I would like to get into this business, and this is a way for me to learn how it works. Because I really don't know much about radio other than I like listening to it. And I want to know how computer systems work, how traffic systems work, how the engineering is connected, and how the signals are broadcast to the towers. He's truly one of the brightest people I've ever met in this business. And he soaked that stuff in like a sponge. And I couldn't be more thrilled for Mike on a couple of levels. One, he's a very successful person. He was an exceptionally gifted legislator at Nebraska. And he has become a true broadcasting leader in our state on a local level.
Statewide.
Yeah, he believes in terrific local broadcasting, and he has invented and created programming and content that is exclusive to Nebraska markets. And I couldn't be more thrilled and impressed by it.
And he owes it all to you?
I wish I could say that. I probably will if he ascends to the White House.
Okay.
Leverage a night in the Lincoln bedroom, which I'm banking on. But in the true spirit of what I truly think is important as a broadcaster, and that is to work with the young people. I was so fortunate. I truly believe that it's an obligation for us to give young people, to feed that passion and give young people a chance to grow and truly wrap their arms around this career.
We'll come back to the genesis of Nebraska football in your career, but as long as we're talking about mentoring young people, you do a lot of work with the University of Nebraska, with students, teaching, lecturing, guiding. What are you doing there and how'd that come about?
When I retired from the broadcast after 25 years on the air, because I was imbalanced at the time. I was not spending enough time at home. I was not spending enough time. I was all about University of Nebraska broadcasting at the time. It was a 7-day-a-week job on top of the morning show at KFAB, on top of corporate partnerships at IMG, on top of the television shows. I was even doing the PA for Husker basketball for 2 years. I just thought, I'm not going to make it to 60 And if I do make it to 60, my wife's going to be long gone, my kids are going to absolutely have found another dad, and I'm going to be alone. So I had one of those cathartic moments, and I think a lot of us do, that I think it's time for you to change course. And there were good opportunities for me at the time to do that. IMG had expanded their footprint with Nebraska to include all the corporate partnerships, not just the broadcast. So there was an opportunity for me to generate revenues for the university and carve out a nice living. The dean of the College of Journalism at the time was a guy named Will Norton, who is also a mentor of mine. And in fact, we just spent some time with Will and Susan at their home in Mississippi the other day. He called me one day and he said, hey, we need to do some things that you do here. We need to start building and broadening the student choices in our college. Not just production and on-air and content, but sales, marketing, branding, and relationship building, which is some of what I did on the air, but also some of what I did on the business side. So would you be willing to teach a class? And I said, well, I don't know anything about teaching a class. I know, that's why I'm asking you to do it. We need some different people here. And they obviously had a terrific roster of professors. They didn't need me, but he was hiring a number of adjunct professors. And that turned into a 6-year deal. Taught several classes down there. The one that I enjoyed the most was the Sports Marketing and Branding Advanced course, because we were able to give practical exercises to the kids. And one of the kids that came through that class is a guy named Adi Kanalik, who was a football player for the Big Red in the mid-2000s. And through, again, I would not imply that my class built the seed that became Hurrdat Social Media, which is now the #1 social media company for athlete brand navigation in the country.
But you helped.
He was doing some things, and his ideas were so good that I introduced those ideas to IMG through Adi, and we actually used Hurrdat while I was at IMG. We actually co-branded some of their clients and our clients on his platform, he and Blake Lawrence. So we had some really gifted people that turned into really terrific marketing folks, not just Blake and Adi, but some of my students went to work for Adidas in Europe. Some of my students went to work for Daktronics and their national sales. That's the big scoreboard company. I was proud of the fact that a lot of these folks got jobs in the sports business. Many of them went to work for sports marketing firms and PR firms that do events. Some of them went to work for these secondary ticket market companies. So I was proud of the fact that these guys finally had the chance in my class to do real practical exercises that they would do if they were working there. And that was the whole idea. We didn't do a lot of lecturing, we did a lot of idea creation and ideation, as they call it. And I think they got a lot out of it. I hear from the students all the time.
One of the best feelings I've ever had, and I know you as well, was when somebody you mentor or educate or work with as a student becomes much more successful than you.
Oh, much more.
And it is very rewarding.
I couldn't be more thrilled for Kevin Kugler. Kevin was my first intern on the talk show when the network launched the talk show in 1993. And I knew he had skills then. He was so bright, and I knew he had skills. And he's carefully crafted his career in a way that should be the envy. He should write a book about how to do it, because it would have been smart for me to pay attention to how he did it. But he was always very disciplined, he was always very strategic, and he put himself in position to expose himself to the right people. And I'm very proud of him. I'm proud of John Bishop. John Baylor is the voice of Husker volleyball and has been now for nearly 30 years. We've talked about Gary Sharp. Lane Grindle is now on the Milwaukee Brewers broadcast. And some of these sales opportunities for kids have really blossomed into great careers and lucrative careers for them.
One of the unheralded assets all of these people have, you and everybody you just mentioned, is a spectacular marriage, a partner that without that partner, you might not have been quite so successful.
She's great. She's a wonderful woman. I've been married to Jana for 27 years. She's a lot smarter than me. She just has poor taste in men. We've all got a soft spot, and that's hers. She also doesn't see too good. That was always a big plus for me. But you know, she was understanding of how much this meant to me and how this was a calling for me. And she also knew from the beginning that I never treated this like a job. I treated it as a craft. Broadcasting is not a job. It's not a business. It's a craft. Now there's a business component to it, but if you worry about it as a business, you'll never be successful. But if you treat it as a craft, you'll never be satisfied. And that's me. And I was never satisfied because I always thought we could do it a little bit better. And so she was very patient with that. She didn't require things of me as much as she probably should have. And so when Jackson was 11 and Alexis was 6, that's when it became clear to me, okay, I'm at a crossroads now. These kids are at a place where they need their dad around a lot more than he is. And I really asked her to give up everything for my deal for a long time. And I'd reached all of my goals. I thought there was another half of my life to go, and I thought maybe it would be important to try some other stuff, see if I can do this too. And so I was pleased that I had the opportunity to stay associated with the Husker Network and with IMG and the university long after I left the broadcast.
All right, let's go back to the Husker Network, the genesis of the Husker Network. You were there at the birth, a difficult birth. KFAB had the exclusive rights for a number of years and expected a renewal of those exclusive rights. Was not to be.
Unfortunately, when you're in the throes of 2-time national championship football performances, the rate goes up a little. And there were people interested in the package in the winter of 1995. Bill Byrne, the athletics director, had every intention of renewing another contract for KFAB for just the radio-only rights, and justifiably so. The KFAB guys had done a great job with it. They made it the centerpiece of their daily life. They promoted it well. They executed it flawlessly. It was really a good marriage. But at the time, we didn't have the Big Ten Network and $50 million coming into the athletic department. The stadium needed to be rebuilt. Coaches' contracts needed to be enhanced. We needed new facilities. And so if somebody comes along and offers you a pretty penny, it's pretty hard to say no. So Paul Aaron, who had been the general manager of the Husker Network, but then went freelance on his own and started his own company, circled some investors together, and they made a bid to take the broadcast rights. And they got it, and it was a really good deal for the university. It really wouldn't have changed the listeners' scenario much because it was going to be largely on the same radio station. But it was great for the U, and the other thing that it did was it gave us a chance to really fully illuminate these other sports. Because at the time, Neil, the only components on the contract were the football games, the men's basketball games, and the sports talk show. The volleyball, women's basketball, and baseball were all ad hoc programs done locally. Well, suddenly, they were part of the network contract, which means they were going out on 25 radio stations every night.
And this was a big, big thing for those coaches.
It was huge. It was a tremendous recruiting advantage and a great, great plus for Paul Sandiford and Angela Beck, who were the women's basketball coaches, and John Cook and Terry Pettit, the volleyball guys, and Dave Van Horn, the baseball coach. They got the kind of statewide exposure that no other college team in the country had. It was truly the best radio package in the country. Remember, this is pre-Big Ten Network. This is pre-television on the internet. This is pre-streaming video. This is big to have your games on the radio. Now, the football team was getting on a lot, the men's basketball team was getting on a lot, but the other sports were not getting on a lot.
Anywhere.
They weren't getting anywhere, and this was big for them. So for us, associated with the broadcast, it was great because we suddenly became, big celebrities. Everybody in the state, from Ogallala to Wayne to West Point to Beatrice, were hearing us do the games. And for me, the baseball broadcasts became a really signature item because when we added baseball, about the time we added baseball to the network package, that's when the Huskers began their renaissance. Dave Van Horn was hired as the head coach. Rob Childress was brought in as the pitching coach. And it was a really, really fun ride to go from, frankly, the worst team in the Big 12 Conference to the #1 team in the country.
The worst stadium, too.
The worst facility. We really shouldn't have gotten good players. We really had no business getting good players. But Dave was so gifted at developing players, he knew there was no way they were going to go in and out-recruit Texas or Oklahoma for somebody in Dallas. But nobody is recruiting baseball players from Missoula, Montana, or from Canada. He would take a hockey player and make him a center fielder. He'd take a volleyball player and make him a left fielder. He took a surfer and made him the winningest pitcher in the history of the program. Shane Komine was a competitive surfer in Hawaii, and he won 47 games for Nebraska in his star-studded 4-year career here. It was a wonderful, wonderful time. I'm still friends with some of those guys, Alex Gordon and Brian Dunsing and Johnny Dorn and Shane and Jabba Chamberlain, and I couldn't be more thankful for the chance to be around those guys when all of that wonderful stuff was happening.
And today we hear a lot about all of these secondary, if you will, sports.
Olympic sports, as they're called.
Yeah, and it's like they've always been in the forefront of Nebraska sports broadcasting.
No doubt. Darren Erstad, I was doing the games when Darren played. He's the best left-handed hitter I've ever seen in college baseball. He's one of the most competitive people I've ever known in athletics. And he's a part of this family, too. So to have this family at hand is rewarding for me. To see them all the time. And, we don't walk down memory lane every time we see each other, but there's a connection there, and that means a lot to me.
Well, I think there's a connection there also because your son is a pitcher.
Yeah.
Jackson is doing pretty well.
He was switched at birth. There's a kid running around with a big mouth that looks like me, doesn't have my name, and then there's somebody out there looking for a tall, good-looking, athletic dude.
So obviously he's got Janus genes.
Yes, we're not sure where this gene pool came from, but I'm not asking too many questions. He's a good guy, and he's worked hard, and he got a degree from the University of Minnesota and got drafted into Major League Baseball, and he's in the Marlins organization now, and he's doing great. And he's a big Nebraska fan too. He still loves Nebraska. Sad that he didn't get to go here, but it was a better situation for him in Minnesota at the time, and we're really proud of him.
I was going to say, not too proud, are you?
And his daughter, and his sister, our daughter Alexis, she's the one that's cursed her life. She wants to be in show business. She caught that little slice of me. She's studying vocal music performance at the University of Mississippi, which is a really good school for that.
Watch for her in the future.
Yeah.
Take me back, University of Nebraska Cornhusker football. Jim Rose always wanted to be the play-by-play voice, and you were.
It was wonderful. I was in Kansas City at the time. I'd left the network. I thought it was really important for me to see if I could swim out into the water a little bit. So got a chance to go to Kansas City and work on the Royals network and do a drive time talk show in Kansas City, highly competitive market. And we were happy there. I was happy there. A great radio station, KMBZ and Entercom, which is now certainly one of the national leaders in addition to iHeart and some of the others. Paul Aaron, the general manager of the network, who later became the principal of Pinnacle Sports, and I remained close. He is one of the true drivers of my career. He gave me most of my opportunity. He gave me the opportunity to do the talk show. He kept me on the broadcasts. He put me on the football broadcasts, on the crew, the third guy on the air with Kent Pavelka and Gary Saddlemeyer, and later Adrian and Warren Swain and all of us. So I'm sitting in my house and the phone rings, and he invited me to come up to a Husker game. This was in the year 2001. And he said, come on up, just hang out in my suite for the game. Sure, no problem. Can you come up a day early? That was like on a Wednesday, and the game, of course, was on Saturday. He said, can you come up a day early? I said, yeah, they can come up a day early. I visit family and friends, harass my old workmates like Neil Nelkin. And he said, well, come up to the office. So I sat down in his office, and he said, I want you to do the football package. And I go, okay, you're talking the Nebraska football package. He goes, yes, the Nebraska football package. He said, I think we need to split this up. He goes, we're happy with the play-by-play guy now, Warren Swain, but he's better suited for the basketball broadcasts. We think his talents are more connected to the basketball broadcasts. And, we've got him doing some other things, some affiliate relations things. So starting next year, I'd like to, shift the announcing duties to a different guy, and you're that guy. And I said, well, you've just made my dream come true. How about that? And he goes, I'm glad I made your day. Now,
ask Jim, he'll do it.
He says, now you'll do this for nothing, won't you? I said, I was afraid you'd ask that because the answer is probably yes. But I said, no, I won't hold you up. And that was never a problem. But I said, what's this looking like? He goes, well, we're switching some affiliates here and there, and there's a couple of political potholes that we got to avoid here, but if you could keep this under your hat for a few weeks, I'd appreciate it. I said, not a problem. So I told my wife, and that was it. I didn't even tell Adrian because he was on the air. But it was just one of the great days of my career. I remember as if it was yesterday. And I did it for 7 years, and I enjoyed it. But, I was on the crew for 15. I was there for the 60-3 run, Neil, and when the team was just so incredibly dominant, and the players were remarkably good, and the tradition that they built and left is just so important to Nebraskans. All those years, from 93 through 99, and then from 2002 through 2007, those were great years for me. And think about it, not only was I there during the greatest run of Nebraska football, but I got to work with Frank Solich, who I've, as I mentioned, had an affection for and a great admiration for years. Eric Crouch is a dear friend to this day. Willie Miller and some of the other great players, Charlie McBride, Milt Tenopir, all of those great coaches and wonderful people. So I got to hang with those guys. I got to do what I always wanted to do, and I'm blessed for that.
Number one greatest moment during those years?
Well, unfortunately for me, I did the games when we kind of took a little, leave of absence from the top 10. We had a couple of great games in there. Obviously, the win over Michigan in the Alamo Bowl, a Michigan team that the next year would be a top 3 team. That was terrific. And Zach Taylor, the quarterback at the time, is also a guy that I consider a friend and someone for whom I have great admiration. For me on the air, the signature highlights for me were baseball highlights because we were going to the College World Series. And I got to call super regional championship moments for us, 2 of them in 2002 and 2005. And Johnny Dorn nearly threw a no-hitter during a broadcast that we had. He was 8 1/3 innings into a no-hitter. That was a wonderful highlight for me. Alex Gordon's towering home run over Wade Townsend, who was a first-round draft pick at Rice, was great. But the signature stories, I think, are more than the highlights themselves. The legendary call of Lyle Bremser's description of Johnny Rogers' punt return. That's a once in multiple lifetime opportunity. I didn't have one of those. Very few broadcasters get those. You could probably count on 2 hands the number of broadcasters who would have a call of that nature endure through the years. But for me, it was the stories and the people. Brooke Berringer was a special guy. And I think the story of Brooke has been well told. It's been told by people who knew him best. But having Brooke around us was a blessing in my life. He was a blessing to Nebraska football. His legend lives today because he will always be 22 years old to us. And he was a remarkably warm and caring and dedicated guy, loving guy. So having that in my career is a highlight. Shane Comine is one of the most inspirational people I've ever met. This is a 5'7", 135-pound kid from Hawaii who dominated college baseball for most of 4 years. He was the most dominant pitcher in college baseball, and he had no business. Physically, he would be laughed off of those metrics that recruiting services use today, and yet our program is forever linked to his success. So having him be around was wonderful. Just those kinds of people. We look at the moments involving sad stories like Lawrence Phillips. Lawrence Phillips is, pound for pound, the greatest football player I have ever seen. He had skills that you could liken to Gale Sayers and very few others. A big kid, 6'2", 215-pounder who ran with the most incredible, almost effortless agility that you can imagine, and yet power, determination, strength, courage. He was a great teammate. He was a very bright guy, but he had just an immensely troubled childhood, which ultimately led to his demise. But guys like Grant Wistrom and the Peter brothers and Eric Crouch, who's a true hero to Nebraskans and will forever be. He's an even better person nearing age 40 than he was as a Heisman Trophy winner. These are the kinds of people that mean so much to me. Tom Osborne, Frank Solich, Danny Nee, Dave Van Horn, John Cook, Bill Byrne, Milt Tenopir. These people are the notes of my opus, and I couldn't be more thankful for that.
2001, you became an author.
Proves anybody can do it.
Tell me about the book.
Well, it was something that I'd actually started thinking about several years before because we were coming to the end of the century. We were coming to the year 2000, and I'm always a history nut. I was a history nut growing up, but I was a Nebraska football history nut. And I just loved every part of it, even the stuff that takes you back to Fielding Yost and Guy Chamberlain and some of the early heroes. So, I always had it in my head, but I didn't know what to do. I don't know anything about writing a book. And one day I get a call from a guy named Mike Swanson, or Tom Swanson rather, from Nebraska Book Company. And I didn't know Tom Swanson. He just said, "Are you Jim Rose from the Nebraska Network?" I said, "Yes." He goes, "Can we have lunch together?" Sure. So we sat down. His boss was a guy named Tom Opegard, who used to listen to the talk show, because he'd mow his yard at night, or he'd go on a walk or a run at night, and he'd listen to Sports Nightly. And he was talking about a Nebraska football book. And he goes, who do we get to do this? And Swanson says, I don't know. And Tom says, why don't you ask Jim Rose to do it? Because there isn't anybody who knows more about the history of Nebraska football that I've heard than this guy. So we sat down and we hatched this out. And it worked out because that's when I was leaving to go to Kansas City. And I had less responsibility on a day-to-day basis in Kansas City than I did when I was here, because I was running the radio station, I was doing the talk show and all the games. So I didn't really have time to do a book if I'd stayed in Nebraska. So moving to Kansas City, somebody upstairs was guiding me properly, and I had the time to do it. And it was a labor of love. It was a labor. If I'd known how hard it is to write a book, I might not have done it. But I'm very proud of it, and I think Nebraskans who have it are happy to have it.
And it's still available.
It's still available. The problem is, it's like any book that covers a certain period of time. Since then, a lot's happened, because this was designed to talk about Nebraska football in the 20th century. So it stopped in 1999, which means there's nothing in there about Eric Crouch. There's nothing in there about Rex Burkhead or Amir Abdullah or any of the other more contemporary stars of Nebraska football.
So it's time for volume 2.
It might be time for volume 2. And the other thing about that book, Bill Byrne was very supportive of me. Bill Byrne is a dear friend, and he kind of gave me a little bit more access than I think most guys get. He kind of gave me access to the stuff and access to the people, and he told them cooperate with Jim Rose. And you know, they didn't make any money off that book, but he was really, I think he's proud of it, but I know that he was a little more generous than most athletic directors would be.
Now you're at KFAB, the legendary 1110 KFAB. You're not just there, you're an integral part of that radio station. Maybe the Lyle Bremser of your time?
Ooh, boy, I wouldn't besmirch Lyle's legacy that way, Neil. You know, it's a great place. It's the station of record. It's Nebraska's radio station, and it has been for nearly 100 years. And it's a genuine honor, and it's a privilege to walk through that door for me every day. And I treat it that way, at least I try to. And the whole genesis of me regularly appearing on KFAB was supposed to be temporary. When I returned to do the Husker games, they were transitioning the games back to KFAB. They had been gone for several years. And it was just supposed to be a 6-month deal where I'd show up, kind of help ease the transition through football season, and then I'd exit stage left after the football season and just go back to doing the games and selling commercials and making appearances. But Gary Saddlemeyer is a Hall of Famer for a reason. He's really good, and he makes you feel really good on the air, and he makes you feel as though you're important and you matter. He's one of the genuinely most gifted people I've ever been around in the business. But that's just his on-air talents. His personality even exceeds that. So we're rolling along. The ratings are good. Everybody seems to be happy. I'm having a good time because of him. I get to be me. It's 50,000 watts. It's the #1 station in the state. It's one of the most popular stations in the region. Something that maybe we could keep this going a while. Well, 18 years later, we're still finding a way to get out of it.
Still getting up early in the morning.
Still getting up early in the morning, and it's not only a good job, but it gives me a chance to be me and express. Not doing the games anymore has sort of curtailed my overall on-air stuff. I fill in here and there. I'll do freelance stuff here and there, and that's fun. But to be able to get on that station and talk to Nebraska like that every single day is huge. And we hear from folks all over the state. We get remarks and feedback from folks in Kearney and North Platte and in Kansas and South Dakota. And it's not just because of the iHeart stream on the digital space. It's because the signal. It's a part of people's lives. And we're coming up on 100 years. And it's a privilege to be a part of it.
And you know how much what you do and say on that station matters to people's lives.
We get texts from people of note when we're talking about stuff in town. The mayor chimes in, the governor chimes in, United States senators. We've had, in fact, Gary and I were talking the other day about the roster of guests that have appeared on that show, and everything from the President of the United States, Vice President of the United States, secretaries of state and defense. We've had movie stars, noted authors like Vince Flynn, soap opera stars like Susan Lucci. We've interviewed probably 300, 400, 500 celebrities, some more than once. Rush Limbaugh's been on the show from time to time. Glenn Beck, they've all been on. And they don't go on every station. We kind of think, well, we're no big deal. Well, then you start thinking, hey, they really don't go on other stations because they want to get heard. And we do move the meter a little bit because the folks who make decisions in our state, venture capitalists, politicos, religious leaders, they listen to the station because they want to know what's going on around town. And it truly is the station of record.
When you go to KFAB, do you feel, in some sense, the mantle of history on your shoulders?
I do.
Going back all those years and what KFAB has meant?
I do. I try to quietly convey that to the other guys too. There is a responsibility here. It's a lot like Nebraska football. You walk down that tunnel, you're not just playing for you, you're playing for everybody who came before you. And that radio station is where Johnny Carson started his career. That radio station is where Ken Hedrick and Walt Kavanaugh and Floyd Calver and Bremser and all of these truly gigantic figures in our business toiled. And if you don't have a respect for that, you probably ought not be in the business because they are a guiding light for us. They are a pathway for us. When we do things on the air, and we fall short once in a while, but when we do things on the air, we think, okay, we know this matters, so treat it with a little bit of care here. What you say impacts people. People are listening to the station because they want to know what you have to offer. So be respectful of that. Ensure that the station's integrity and its reputation for excellence is always foremost. Again, we fall short once in a while, but I think about it all the time, and I think about it more now than ever, and I hope we're measuring up.
Big station, big company, but to some degree, you operate like a small-town radio station.
It's one of the lessons I've learned, Neil. I think when we're all young and we get into it, when I went to Salina, I was a big shot. I'm from Nebraska, I'm from Lincoln. I covered Nebraska football. And I get to a small town and I don't have a lot of respect for some of the things that were done there because I'm thinking, why are they doing that? Or that sounds stupid. And you learn over time that what makes a really great community, whether it's Omaha or Salina, Kansas, or North Platte or Beatrice or Chicago, what makes a great community is the capacity for the community to have a conversation with itself. And that means everybody has to be welcome. That means everybody counts. That means nobody is smarter than the other guy. That they may say more intelligent things, but that doesn't make them smarter. Nobody is irrelevant, and everybody counts, so everybody's view counts because we're all a part of this. And I may not like a program, but that program has value to some people. It has value from a marketing standpoint. It has value for a lifestyle standpoint. And you grow to understand that to truly be a great broadcaster, I believe, or a really important part of the community is to engage the community in having a conversation with itself and to go at great pains to ensure that everybody is included, even diverse opinions or those who may not share your belief or even the belief of the majority of your audience. Because we're all different, and what makes Omaha a great community is because of stations like KFAB.
And you have to ask the tough questions that people don't want to talk about.
You have to say things that people might find objectionable. You have to engage opinion that sometimes is offensive or uncomfortable. I've always believed that it's irresponsible to not engage people's emotions and not elicit response, because that's when change happens. That's when action is taken. When you are compelled to action, good or bad, it's because you've been compelled to do it by something that someone said or that you read or that you saw. So I know some people say, why did you do that? Or I hate that, or you're stupid, or you don't know what you're talking about. And all of that's fine, because I've always believed in this mantra, and that is, I don't really worry about what other people think about me because it's none of my business. And it's starting to take on, it's catching on. People think about that, it catches on. Because if you worry about whether people agree or disagree with you, if you're only looking for people who agree with you, this ain't the business, No. You need to be willing to say, you know what, I hadn't thought of it that way. I don't agree with you, but I'm sure glad you said so. Or, You know, I don't believe that, and you shouldn't say that about that person. And somebody's going to be offended by that. And I don't know, Lyle used to tell his guys on the air, there's a real good chance that if you crack that microphone and you say anything other than time and temperature, somebody's going to be upset about it. If that's the bar, might as well go for broke, Neil, because if all we're going to do is time and temp, I'm not sure they need me for that. They can find somebody a lot cheaper.
With all you've done, all the people you've worked with, worked for, everything you've accomplished, what's next? What do you want to do?
I haven't done my best broadcast yet. That's my problem. I'm in the 5th decade now, and I still haven't done my best broadcast. I still haven't gotten it exactly right. And so every day for me, it's important for me to understand the story a little bit better, write it a little better, tell it a little bit better, emphasize the right thing, find the true sweet spot in what matters to people, get someone to gin up an emotional response, happy, sad, angry, or otherwise. And I still haven't done that. And I don't know how much time I got left. We're all day to day in this business. But for me, it's that dogged pursuit of trying to have my best broadcast. And hopefully I'll get there. But if I don't, at least I will have given it 65 years of trying.
Well, you certainly left a legacy and a heritage.
It's a great business, Neil, and there are wonderful people in it, and I've been blessed to be around a lot of them. I just wish I'd spent a little bit more time listening to them.
Our thanks to Jim Rose. He's been our guest today on the Nebraska Broadcasters Association History Project. Also thanks to Jeff Sabin and the people here at WOWT Channel 6 in Omaha. For the Nebraska Broadcasters Association, Executive Director Jim Timm and Chairman Emeritus Marty Riemenschneider. For the NBA History Project, I'm Neil Nelkin.